I remember vividly the moment I took over this case. A young man had disappeared in a remote forest area. Local police had searched for him without success, and I was called in to take over the case. Initially, everything looked like a typical missing person case, someone who had gotten lost or run into trouble, but I couldn't have imagined how different this case would become. As I reviewed the files, I noticed that the young man had been well prepared. He had left a precise plan of his route, was an experienced hiker, and didn't seem to have taken any risks. Yet, something about this forest disturbed me. The locals had told stories that didn't fit the reports, rumors of people vanishing without a trace and inexplicable noises heard in the darkness. I decided to investigate the area myself. The hikers' last known whereabouts were deep in the forest, far from the usual hiking trails. The forest was dense and silent, almost oppressive. I'm not a man who believes in the supernatural, but it was hard to ignore the eerie feeling that came over me when I entered the forest. It was as if the forest was watching me. I began to methodically search the area. At first, everything seemed normal, no signs of a struggle, no obvious indications of an accident. But the deeper I went into the forest, the more the feeling grew that something was wrong here. It was too quiet, too perfect. I decided to spend the night in the forest to see if perhaps something inexplicable would reveal itself. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. Night fell quickly, and with the darkness came a feeling of apprehension that I couldn't shake off. I sat quietly in my tent, going over the evidence again, when suddenly I heard something, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind rustling through the trees, but the air was still. The whispering was clear, as if someone was speaking softly right next to me. I turned on my flashlight and shone it into the darkness. Nothing. No person, no animal, but the whispering didn't stop. It seemed to come from all sides, and although I couldn't understand the words, I knew they were meant for me. It was a feeling I had never encountered in all my years as a detective. I tried to calm myself and ignore the whispering. I told myself there must be a rational explanation. Perhaps the trees carried the sound differently. But the longer I listened, the louder and more insistent it became. It was as if the forest itself was speaking to me. I couldn't shake the thought that I was not welcome. The night stretched on endlessly. The whispering never stopped, and I couldn't sleep. Every minute that passed made the fear inside me grow. I was an experienced investigator, but this situation was different. This wasn't just about a puzzle that needed to be solved. It felt as if the forest itself had something to hide. When dawn finally came, the whispering ceased as suddenly as it had begun. The silence of the forest returned, but the feeling of threat remained. I knew that this case was more than I had initially assumed. The next morning, I set about re-examining the area. I wanted to find physical evidence, something tangible that could help me solve the mystery. After hours of searching, I finally discovered tracks on the ground. They were deep and large, but strangely shaped, too irregular to be human, but also not typical of an animal. I knelt down to examine the tracks more closely. They led deeper into the forest, and I decided to follow them. It was my best lead, yet after about 100 meters they suddenly ended. No clue as to where the creature had gone. It was as if it had simply vanished. This thought disturbed me greatly. In all my years of investigation, I had never seen tracks cease so abruptly. Nothing just disappears, at least not in the world I knew. I took photos and meticulously noted everything, but I couldn't find any rational explanations. As I stood there, looking at where the tracks ended, a strange feeling came over me. It was as if the forest was deliberately misleading me, as if it was only showing me what it wanted. I couldn't say why I thought that, but the idea wouldn't leave me. I returned to camp, but the forest felt even more threatening than before. The whispering in the night, the irregular tracks, everything seemed to point to something I couldn't comprehend, but I was determined to continue. On the third night, the whispering began again, but this time it was louder. I lay awake, my flashlight ready, when I suddenly heard something else: footsteps. They were soft, almost as if someone was creeping through the undergrowth. My heart beat faster, and I grabbed my flashlight. When I directed the beam into the darkness, I saw nothing. No person, no animal. I stood up, my breath quickening, and slowly turned in a circle to scan the surroundings. The footsteps were gone, but the whispering remained. It was now so loud that it felt as if it was reverberating directly in my head. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was here, and it didn't want me to see it. I called out into the darkness, asking if anyone was there, but no answer came. The whispering seemed to come closer, swirling around me. I didn't know if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me, but the fear I felt was real. I couldn't sit still any longer. Something compelled me to move. I went deeper into the forest, even though every part of me told me to turn back, but the whispering wouldn't let me go. Suddenly, without warning, I heard a snap directly behind me. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing, no person, no animal, just the dense, impenetrable forest. I returned to camp, my heart pounding wildly. Whatever was here, it was playing with me. I knew I was no longer alone. The forest had noticed me. In the morning, I woke up with a heavy feeling. The thought of giving up the case crossed my mind for the first time. I had been drawn deep into something I didn't understand, and the events of the previous night had deeply unsettled me. Should I just leave and let the case remain unsolved? It seemed like the most sensible decision, yet a part of me couldn't allow that. I was a detective, I had a job to do, and as much as I wanted to, I couldn't just run away. There were answers I had to find, and I was determined to get them, no matter how great the danger lurking before me. I decided to go deeper into the forest. There was no other way. The tracks, the strange noises, the whispering, all of it indicated that something was happening here that went far beyond what I had imagined. But I had to know. I had to find out what had happened to the hiker. I packed my equipment and set off. With every step, the feeling of threat grew stronger. The forest seemed alive, almost as if it was watching me. The whispering had disappeared during the day, but I knew it would return once darkness set in. I knew it was a risk, but I had no choice. The case had now become personal. As I ventured deeper into the forest, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. In the middle of the dense thicket, I found the missing hiker's clothing. It lay neatly folded on a tree stump, as if someone had deliberately placed it there. There were no signs of violence, no clue as to what had happened to him. I knelt down and examined the clothing. It was intact, not a stain, not a tear. It was as if the man had simply undressed and vanished. But that made no sense. Why would someone leave their clothes in the middle of the forest, and where had he gone? As I was bent over the clothes, I suddenly heard the whispering again. It was different from before, louder, more menacing, almost as if it was calling me. My stomach clenched, and I hastily stood up. I couldn't stay. The forest didn't want me here. I took photos, collected evidence, and decided to leave the place as quickly as possible. But the whispering followed me, even as I searched for the way back. It seemed as if the forest was holding me, as if it didn't want to let me go. With every step, the feeling grew that I had stumbled into something much larger than I could comprehend. I knew I was no longer alone. Something was watching me, and it wasn't ready to let me go. As I tried to find my way back, I realized that the forest had changed. The paths I had taken before were no longer there. Every tree, every rock looked the same. I walked in circles, trying to find a landmark, but it was futile. The forest had trapped me. The whispering was now louder, more intense. It was as if the forest had come alive, as if it was deliberately misleading me. With every step I took, the exit seemed further away. I felt lost, helpless. My mind told me to stay calm, that I would find a way, but the panic wouldn't be suppressed. I stopped and tried to breathe deeply. Panic wouldn't help me, I knew that, but the fact that I couldn't orient myself made me despair. I called out into the forest, but the echo of my own voice was the only thing that came back. Minutes passed, and with every step, the forest seemed to close in further. I couldn't say how long I wandered, but it felt like hours. Darkness began to fall, and the feeling that I was no longer alone grew stronger. I couldn't see it, but I felt it. Something was following me. I had no choice. I had to find shelter and wait out the night. Perhaps daylight would show me the way, but deep down I knew that the forest wouldn't release me so easily. On the final night, the whispering reached its peak. It was louder and more intense than ever before, as if the forest itself wanted to speak to me. I had settled in a small clearing to pass the night, but there was no peace. The whispering was everywhere, and I couldn't shake the distinct impression that it was coming closer. I sat with my flashlight in hand, eyes wide open, when suddenly footsteps were heard behind me. They were the same soft, creeping footsteps I had heard before. This time, however, they were closer, as if something was moving directly towards me. My heart pounded, and I turned around, but there was nothing. I called out into the darkness again, but no answer came. The footsteps ceased, but the whispering remained. It was now so loud that I could barely think straight. It was as if the forest was taking over my thoughts, as if it wanted me to do something. But what? Then suddenly I saw it, a figure just a few meters away from me, hidden in the shadows. It stood still, motionless, yet I knew it was watching me. The whispering grew louder, almost deafening, and I couldn't breathe. The figure came closer, slowly, inexorably. I knew this was the moment I had to go. Without hesitation, I grabbed my things and ran. I ran through the forest, stumbling over roots, but I couldn't stop. The whispering pursued me, seeming to echo in my mind. I ran until I finally reached the edge of the forest. I had escaped, but the whispering remained in my head, and to this day I wonder what it truly was that pursued me that night. Back in the city, I didn't feel safe. Even though I had escaped the forest, I had the eerie feeling that a part of me was still there. The whispering haunted me even in my dreams. I couldn't sleep without feeling watched. Every night, I heard the same uncanny voices calling to me. I tried to put what I had experienced into words, wrote reports, and analyzed the evidence I had collected, but nothing could explain what I had witnessed there. The photos of the tracks were blurred, the recordings unclear. It was as if the forest itself didn't want the truth to come to light. I spoke with my superiors about the case, but they were skeptical. For them, it was a simple missing person case that couldn't be pursued further without clear evidence. But I knew it was more. The forest had something dark about it, something that made people disappear, and I had barely escaped. Days passed, but the feeling that the forest was still reaching for me wouldn't let me go. I had the feeling that whatever was out there hadn't forgotten that I had escaped it. It was waiting for the right moment to reclaim me. Eventually, I started to neglect my work. I couldn't concentrate, couldn't stop thinking about the whispering. It was everywhere in my thoughts, in the sounds around me. I knew I would have to go back soon to solve the mystery once and for all. One evening, as I sat in a bar on the outskirts of town, I met an old man who spoke directly to me. "You saw it, didn't you?" His words surprised me. I hadn't told him anything about my case, yet he seemed to know exactly what was on my mind. "The forest, it takes what belongs to it," he said softly, never taking his eyes off me. I was shocked. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. The old man leaned back and sighed. "Many have disappeared there, and none have ever returned. The forest doesn't let them go. Whatever lives there, it's older than us. It hates intruders." A shiver ran down my spine. The old man spoke of vanished hikers, of people who had left traces in the forest but were never found. "Your colleague," he began, "he's part of it now, and if you go back, the forest will take you too." His words hit me hard. I had suspected it, but now someone had articulated what I hadn't dared to voice. The forest had taken my colleague, and there was no way to bring him back. Yet the whispering in my head grew louder. It urged me to return. I knew I had no other choice. I left the bar with a feeling of helplessness. The old man had given me no answers, only grim premonitions, but deep inside I knew I would return soon, no matter what awaited me there. The nights became unbearable. The whispering in my head was constant now. It wouldn't let me sleep, wouldn't let me think. It was as if the forest was calling me to itself, as if it wanted to reclaim me. I knew there was no escape. I had to go back and face what was waiting for me there. One night, without telling anyone, I made my way back into the forest. The moon shone through the trees, and I felt the whispering leading me deeper inside. It was no longer frightening, it was comforting. The forest had called me, and I was ready to come to it. The deeper I went, the louder the whispering became. I followed the familiar paths until I reached the clearing again. There, in the middle of the darkness, stood a figure. It was my colleague, or what was left of him. His face was blank, without eyes, without a mouth, just a smooth surface staring at me. The whispering reached its peak as I walked towards him. I couldn't resist. It was as if my legs were being pulled by an invisible force. The figure stood motionless, yet I felt it was expecting me. The forest had called me back, and now I was here. I knew this was the end. There was no escape. I had become a part of the forest, and the whispering would never let me go again. In that moment, the whispering fell silent. The figure in front of me didn't move, but I felt I was no longer alone. The forest had taken me in. I was now a part of it, just like my colleague before me. The feeling of fear had vanished, replaced by a strange calm. I looked around and saw how the darkness of the forest surrounded me. There was no way back. The forest had called me, and I had come. The voices that had haunted me for so long fell silent, but I knew they would always be there, deep inside me, waiting until they called me again. I sat down on the ground of the clearing, gazing into the distance. The whispering was now a part of me, and I knew I would never return to the world from which I had come. The forest had taken me. There was no escape. I had just hung up my jacket and sat down in the armchair when the telephone rang. It was late, and calls at this hour rarely meant anything good. A man answered on the other end, his voice nervous and brittle. He said he was from the railway and urgently needed help. A worker had vanished without a trace, deep inside an old, disused tunnel beneath the city. His voice trembled with fear. I had dealt with strange missing person cases before, but the man's description sent a shiver down my spine. The tunnel had been closed for decades, yet someone had dared to venture in. Now, the worker, who was only routinely securing the area, was gone, no trace, no sound, nothing. I could hear the tremor in his voice as he mentioned they had heard strange noises from inside just before the man disappeared. My curiosity was piqued. Such cases always drew me in. Even if a part of me knew, I often got involved in things that were better left undisturbed. But this call felt different, more urgent, more dangerous. Without further thought, I packed my flashlight, a recording device, and set off for the meeting point. When I arrived, 2 men were waiting for me, both pale and visibly frightened. The older of the 2 silently led me to a rusty gate that blocked the tunnel's entrance. Beyond it lay the maw of darkness, a place that greeted me with a chill that wasn't just from the damp air. The older man, who introduced himself as the construction site manager, hesitated briefly before opening the rusty gate. I stepped into the darkness. My flashlight cast a thin beam of light that illuminated the thick, damp walls of the tunnel. The smell of musty water and old rock hung heavy in the air, but what disturbed me more was the absolute silence. No drips, no rustling. Nothing, just my own labored breathing and the faint hum of the air. I had explored abandoned places before, but this tunnel had something about it that felt wrong. Every step echoed loudly in the endless darkness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The tunnel seemed to be watching me. There were no sounds from the surface, no signs of life. All that existed was the endless chasm that stretched before me. I followed the tracks deeper inside, and the further I went, the stronger the feeling of apprehension became. The worker had disappeared somewhere here, but so far there were no signs of what had happened to him, no bloodstains, no signs of a struggle, nothing. It was as if he had simply been swallowed by the earth. Suddenly, without warning, I heard a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. I stopped, held my breath, and listened. The sound was so soft that at first I wasn't sure if I was just imagining it. But there it was again, clearer this time. It sounded as if it came from the deepest corners of the tunnel. The whispering grew louder, and although I couldn't make out any words, it was distinctly human. A cold shiver ran down my spine. My instincts screamed at me to turn around and leave the tunnel immediately, but something held me back. The whispering seemed to call to me, to lure me deeper into the tunnel, like an echo from a long-forgotten past. I continued, flashlight held firmly in my hand. As the whispering grew louder, it was as if the tunnel itself was alive, telling its own stories that should never have been heard. Every fiber of my body was tense, and the damp air seemed to grow heavier. Somewhere out there, deep in the darkness, something was waiting for me. Suddenly, I felt a movement in the corner of my eye. I spun around lightning fast, but my light only caught emptiness. Yet, I was sure something had been there, something moving in the dark, just outside my field of vision. I called out the missing worker's name, but my voice only echoed eerily with no reply. Nothing. I knew it was dangerous to continue, but I was too deep now to turn back. Something inside me wanted to find the truth, no matter how horrifying it might be. Every step deeper into the tunnel felt like I was traveling back in time, to an era when this place was alive. But now, it seemed only to be a tomb waiting for its victims. Suddenly, without warning, a terrible sound broke the silence. It was a dull crash, followed by a scraping, unnatural noise, as if something heavy was being dragged across the floor. My heart skipped a beat, and I spun around, lamp firmly in hand. But again, there was nothing to be seen, just the darkness that seemed to swallow me whole. I knew I wasn't alone. Whatever lurked in this tunnel, it was real, and it was not friendly. The sound repeated, louder this time, and I could barely stand it. It sounded like metal scraping on stone, accompanied by a dull thud that made me believe something large, something inexplicable, was approaching. My pulse raced. I seriously considered leaving the tunnel before it was too late, but a part of me simply couldn't go. This was no ordinary case anymore. Whatever was here, it had taken the worker, and I had to find out how and why. My hands trembled as I ventured deeper into the tunnel, following the sound, even though every instinct in me screamed at me to turn back. Then suddenly, everything fell silent. The stillness returned, even more oppressive than before, yet I knew it wasn't over. Somewhere out there in the impenetrable darkness, something was waiting. I was now so deep in the tunnel that even the lamp provided little light. Darkness devoured everything beyond the narrow cone of light. But then, in the distance, I saw something, a faint glow that wasn't from my lamp. It was strange, unnatural. Slowly, cautiously, I approached the source of the light. When I finally arrived, my breath caught. Before me lay something I never wanted to see. It was the missing worker, or rather what was left of him. His body was grotesquely twisted, as if something had seized him and broken him with inhuman strength. His eyes were wide open, and a silent scream seemed frozen on his face. The strange light came from a small, ancient lamp lying beside him, flickering faintly. It seemed he had held it in his last despair, but what shocked me most was what lurked beside him in the shadows. It was a kind of symbol, carved into the stone, ancient and sinister, as if it had been hidden here for centuries. I felt sick. The tunnel was no normal place. Something dark, evil, lurked here, and it had taken the worker. I took a few photos, but my hands trembled so much that I could barely hold the camera steady. I had to get out of here immediately. With trembling hands, I put the camera back in my pocket. The sight of the mutilated worker made my blood run cold, but I forced myself to remain calm. I had to keep a clear head to find my way back, but with every step I took back towards the exit, it felt as if the tunnel was closing in on me. The eerie scratching, the dull thudding, it returned, louder and more threatening this time. My breathing quickened, and I could feel the sweat on my forehead. Something was behind me, something moving in the darkness, always just outside my field of vision. I was sure I was being pursued. I started to walk faster, then to run. My flashlight wobbled, the light flickered, and the feeling of panic became overwhelming. The tunnel seemed endless, as if I was trapped in a dream from which there was no escape. The exit was far away, and with every step it seemed to recede further. Suddenly, my flashlight went out, and I was plunged into complete darkness. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. All I could hear was my own breathing and the incessant scratching that approached relentlessly. I forced myself to switch the lamp back on, and to my great shock, it worked again. But the beam of light fell on something, a figure in the darkness, directly in front of me. My flashlight's beam briefly caught a figure standing there, motionless, faceless. Its form was human, but its face was a blank, smooth surface without eyes, without a mouth. It was as if all features had been erased. I couldn't move, my breath caught, and I felt the cold of the tunnel permeate me. The figure simply stood there, directly in my path, and although it had no eyes, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was staring at me. It made no sound, no movement. Yet the darkness around it seemed alive, as if being swallowed by it. The scratching stopped, but the silence was almost worse. I knew I couldn't stay still, so I took a step back slowly, almost in a trance. But as I turned to look for another way, I heard footsteps behind me, heavy, slow footsteps that followed me. I turned around, but the figure was gone, yet the feeling of being watched remained. I ran on, my flashlight held firmly in my hand. There was no clear thought left in my head, only the urge to escape this cursed tunnel. The footsteps behind me grew faster, louder, as if the darkness itself wanted to swallow me. I didn't know how long I had been running, but the tunnel seemed to be changing. The walls that had once run straight now seemed to twist and distort, as if the tunnel were alive. Every turn I took led me deeper into the unknown, as if there was no longer any exit. I was trapped in a labyrinth that did not operate by the rules of reality. My footsteps echoed loudly in the darkness, but they no longer seemed alone. Something followed me, invisible but always present. The cold of the tunnel crept into my bones, and my senses began to deceive me. The walls seemed to move, as if breathing, and every time I rounded a corner, I expected to encounter the faceless figure. But the worst was the whispering. It was back, louder and clearer than ever before. I couldn't understand the words, but they filled my head, invading my mind, as if the tunnel itself was trying to break me. It was a whisper that went deeper than any physical threat. It seemed to seize my mind, as if the tunnel was trying to drive me to madness. I knew I could no longer search for a logical way out. The tunnel was playing with me, twisting reality until nothing made sense anymore. Every step felt like I was plunging deeper into an abyss from which there was no escape. Suddenly, as if from nowhere, the tunnel opened before me. I stood in a large chamber whose walls were covered with strange symbols carved into the stone. In the center of the chamber lay something ancient, something that didn't belong here. It was an altar roughly hewn from the rock, covered with incomprehensible inscriptions. The room itself seemed to breathe, as if alive. I felt a deep, ancient power lurking in this chamber, something older than the tunnel itself. Everything around me suddenly seemed to stand still, and I knew I had found something that would have been better left hidden. The tunnel was not just an abandoned place. It was a prison, a place where something dark had rested for centuries, and it was ready to awaken. As I examined the altar more closely, I noticed that the symbols on the walls pulsed, almost as if reacting to my presence. A part of me wanted to document everything, collect evidence, but I felt I had to hurry. Something in here didn't want me to escape alive. Just as I turned to leave, I heard the whispering again, this time louder than ever before. It was all around me, and then I saw it, the faceless figure standing before the altar. It moved slowly towards me, and I knew I had no more time. I ran as fast as I could. The tunnel seemed to close around me, as if it didn't want to let me go. Every step felt heavy, as if the darkness itself was pushing against me. The whispering was everywhere, filling my head, allowing no clear thoughts. There was only one escape: find the exit before it was too late. My flashlight flickered and finally went out. Now I was completely engulfed in the darkness that enveloped me like a living entity. Yet I couldn't stand still. Something was pursuing me, something I couldn't see, but whose presence I felt. It was close, so close that I could feel the cold sensation of breath on my neck. I stumbled, fell to the hard ground, but I couldn't give up. My body was exhausted, but sheer panic drove me on. I crawled further, blindly, unsure where I was going, yet I knew I was approaching the exit, or at least I hoped so. The scratching behind me grew louder, faster, as if it was just waiting for me to make a mistake. Suddenly, I saw it, a faint light in the distance, the exit. I gathered all my strength and sprinted. My heart pounded in my chest. The darkness behind me seemed alive, wanting to swallow me, but I managed to reach the exit. With one last leap, I thrust myself into freedom. As I stumbled out of the tunnel, I fell to my knees, breathing heavily. The fresh air outside was almost painful in my lungs after the stuffy, cold darkness of the tunnel. The men who had led me to the tunnel earlier were gone. I was alone. The silence of the night surrounded me, but it was a peace that felt safer than the one in the tunnel. I looked back at the dark entrance of the tunnel and could barely believe that I had escaped the madness. The tunnel still seemed to watch me, as if it wanted to drag me back. The whispering had ceased, but it left an echo in my mind that I couldn't shake. The images of the faceless figure and the altar were burned into my thoughts. I knew I would never truly be free from what was down there. It would always haunt me, no matter how far I ran. The tunnel had awakened something dark within me, something I could no longer ignore. I made my way back to the city, my thoughts still racing. Whatever I had discovered, it was ancient, evil, and merely waiting to be unleashed again. The worker I had been looking for was just another victim of this place, and I had narrowly escaped the same fate. Weeks have passed since I left the tunnel, but the memories don't let me go. Every night I dream of the darkness, of the whispering that tried to drive me to madness. Even now, in the quiet moments, I sometimes hear a faint, menacing whisper coming from the shadows. I have tried to forget the incident, to dismiss it as a nightmare, but the truth is not so easily suppressed. The tunnel still exists, deep beneath the city, and I know it's only a matter of time before someone else goes in, someone who makes the same mistakes I did. I can't prove it, and yet I know that the tunnel is not just a place. It is a trap, a living prison for something unimaginable. And as I sit here, alone in my office, I feel the whispering returning. It's back, louder than before, and I know the tunnel won't let me go. There is no escape. It was a rainy afternoon when the call came into my office. The voice on the other end belonged to a mother, utterly distraught and panicked. Her son, an 8-year-old boy, had been missing for 2 days without a trace. The local police had already searched, but without success. She felt she wasn't being taken seriously enough when she said the boy hadn't just run away. I listened intently. Missing person cases, especially involving children, are always sensitive. But the mother seemed to be hiding something, as if she wasn't telling me everything. Her voice trembled not just with fear, but with something else, perhaps shame or guilt. I couldn't quite decipher it, but something wasn't right here. I took the case, promising to come as soon as possible. On the drive to her remote house on the outskirts of the city, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that this wasn't just an ordinary missing person case. Something darker was in the air that I couldn't yet grasp. When I arrived at the old, dilapidated house, I immediately noticed the eerie silence of the surroundings. No neighbors in sight, no sound except for the gentle drumming of rain on the roof. The mother opened the door, her eyes red from crying, but something about her gaze was different. She looked not only exhausted, but also frightened, as if she was expecting something. Inside the house, the atmosphere was oppressive. It smelled of damp, and the walls were covered with old family photos. The boy, Paul, smiled in many of these pictures, a cheerful child whose disappearance made everything even more incomprehensible. I sat opposite the mother and began to ask my questions. She was nervous, constantly rubbing her hands as if trying to calm herself. "When did you last see Paul?" I asked quietly. She told me he had been playing in his room the night before. Everything was normal until she suddenly heard a strange knocking that seemed to come from the walls. When she checked on him, the window was wide open and Paul was gone. I asked if she had opened the window herself, perhaps by accident. She just shook her head and whispered, "He heard it." I asked what she meant by that, but she evaded the question. Her gaze kept drifting to an old wooden door at the end of the hallway that led to the cellar. "What do you mean?" "He heard it," I asked again, more insistently this time. Her eyes widened and she whispered, "The knocking. It had been coming for days, but I thought it would stop again. I thought it was just the wind." But it wasn't the wind, I knew that. It was something I didn't yet understand, but it made me uneasy. I decided to examine the boy's room. As I entered, I immediately noticed that it seemed untouched. His toys were neatly arranged, his bed was made, and the window was still slightly ajar. But what caught my attention was the cold. The room was significantly colder than the rest of the house, even though the window was barely open. I went to the window and looked at the surroundings outside. There were no signs of a struggle, no tracks in the damp soil. It was as if the boy had simply dissolved. But then I noticed something. In the dust on the windowsill, there were fingerprints small, like a child's, yet they weren't normal. The fingerprints seemed distorted, as if the hand that left them wasn't human. I knelt down to examine the marks more closely when I suddenly heard a faint knocking. It was barely perceptible, but it clearly came from the walls of the room. Slowly, I stood up and went to the wall from which the sound seemed to come. It sounded as if something or someone was knocking on the other side of the wall. But that made no sense. Behind that wall was only the empty space of the attic. An unpleasant feeling spread in my chest. I took a few photos of the fingerprints and left the room. The thought that something lurked within the walls of the house wouldn't leave me. When I returned to the living room, I noticed that the mother was more nervous than before. Her gaze kept wandering to the cellar door, and I knew there had to be something down there. "What's in the cellar?" I asked. She hesitated, then slowly stood up and led me to the door. She opened it carefully, as if afraid of what might lie behind it. The musty smell that rose from the darkness of the cellar was overwhelming. An old, shaky staircase led down, and I switched on my flashlight before taking a step. The mother stayed upstairs, staring silently after me as I slowly descended the steps. The cellar was old, damp, and cluttered with boxes and furniture that hadn't been used in a long time. But as I went deeper into the room, I felt that I wasn't alone. The room was silent, but the air was heavy, as if filled with an invisible presence. I shone the flashlight around and stopped at a corner. There on the back wall, something was carved, ancient symbols scratched into the stones. They looked like primitive protective signs, yet they were weathered, as if they hadn't been renewed for a long time. Suddenly, I heard the knocking again. It was louder down here, much clearer. It seemed to come from the wall behind the symbols, growing closer, and my heart beat faster. Whatever was behind this wall, it was not natural. When I left the cellar, the mother was barely able to look me in the eye. I knew she was holding back more than she admitted, and I decided to confront her about it. What really happened? I asked sharply as she nervously wrung her hands. You know this isn't a normal case. What have you been hiding from me? Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she began to speak softly. It started when we moved in here, she whispered. Paul told me he could hear something in the walls, something calling him. At first, I dismissed it as imagination, but the knocking, it got louder and louder. Then one night, I heard it too. She told me about strange dreams she and her son had been having, dreams of a figure living in the walls, watching them, calling to them. She felt that the house itself was alive, that it craved Paul. And then, when the knocking became unbearable, he had simply disappeared. I thought I could ignore it, she sobbed. I thought it would stop. I thought it would stop if I just ignored it, she whispered as tears ran uncontrollably down her cheeks. But I was wrong. It wanted him. It took him. Her body trembled as she said this. I could feel she was telling the truth, even if she didn't fully understand what was happening herself. She was convinced that the house itself was responsible for her son's disappearance. I glanced back at the cellar door. The symbols on the wall, the knocking in the walls, all of it pointed to something much larger and more sinister. This house was no normal place, and it was clear that dark forces had been at work here for a long time. But who or what was it, and why did it crave Paul? It started speaking to him in his dreams, she said suddenly, as if recalling a memory. He told me it promised to take him if he would just open the door. I always warned him never to answer, but I think he couldn't resist. The silence that followed was oppressive. It was as if the entire house was waiting for what would happen next. I knew I had to do something. It wasn't enough just to listen and ask questions. If Paul was still alive, I had to find him, and the answer lay somewhere deep within this cursed house. The cellar was the key, I knew that now. Yet it wasn't just the cellar, it was the whole place. As if it itself was a living being waiting to swallow me as soon as I ventured too far inside. I resolved to descend into the cellar once more, this time with a clearer mind and more determination. The mother pleaded with me not to go back. They'll take him too, she said with an expression of desperation in her eyes. They'll take them like they did Paul. But I couldn't back down. This was personal now. With a faint nod, I said goodbye to her and stepped back through the old wooden door, which creaked shut behind me. The musty smell of the cellar was now more intense, almost suffocating. The descent felt even longer than the first time, as if the stairs were pulling me deeper into the heart of darkness. With the flashlight in hand, I returned to the wall where the symbols were carved. The knocking was back, louder, incessant. Something was waiting behind this wall, and this time I knew I couldn't ignore it. The symbols on the wall flickered in the faint light of my flashlight, and the longer I looked, the more they seemed to move, pulsing with an energy I didn't understand. I placed my hand on the cold stone, and the knocking abruptly ceased. The sudden silence was even more terrifying than the sound before. I knew something was here, and I had to find out what it was. With all my strength, I began to pull at the loose stones that made up the wall. It was arduous, but after a few minutes, one of the stones gave way. Behind it was a hollow space, and an icy draft hit my face. I shone my flashlight inside and saw something that made my blood run cold. In the darkness of the cavity lay an old doll, tattered and dirty. Beside it lay a broken wooden train. These were a child's toys, but they looked as if they had been here for decades, and yet they belonged to Paul. I had seen the same toys in his room upstairs. What on earth were they doing down here? I crawled further into the cavity, even though every fiber of my body told me to turn back. But I couldn't stop. Something was down here, and it was magically drawing me in. Suddenly, I felt a movement behind me. I whirled around, flashlight firmly in my hand. In the dim light, I saw something standing in the darkness. It wasn't a figure I could clearly distinguish, more a shadow moving in the corners of the room, as if it lived in the darkness. My breath caught as the creature slowly moved towards me. It was silent, yet I could feel it watching me as if studying me. I wanted to cry out, but my voice failed. Whatever this was, it didn't belong in this world. It was something ancient, something forgotten that had lurked in the shadows of this house until it took Paul, and now I was its next target. My heart pounded as I tried to control my panic. I had to find a way out before it was too late. The creature came closer, its outlines becoming clearer. It wasn't human, that was clear to me. It seemed to be made of shadows themselves, a kind of manifestation of the evil that permeated this house. Then, without warning, I heard the knocking again, this time right next to me. I jumped back as a cold breath brushed past me. The creature paused as if waiting for something. I knew I had to act fast. Without thinking, I ran out of the cavity and back into the cellar. The knocking pursued me, seeming to come from the walls, as if the house itself was alive and hunting me. No, back in the cellar, I closed the door to the cavity behind me, but I knew that wouldn't be enough. Whatever it was, it wouldn't stop until it had me. I turned to the symbols on the wall. They had to mean something. Perhaps they were a kind of protection against what lurked here. The mother hadn't mentioned any of this, but she must have known about the existence of these signs. These symbols were here to keep something at bay, but the protective signs were old and worn. Their power was exhausted. Perhaps they had held back the evil for a while, but now that they were weakening, it could roam free. I took out my phone and took photos of the symbols. I would have to examine them later, but for now I had to focus on the here and now. The knocking was back, this time so loud that it echoed in my head. There was no doubt I was in a race against time. There had to be a way to stop the creature, but I had no idea how. The mother upstairs in the house was afraid, I knew that, but perhaps she knew more than she let on. I had to get back to her before it was too late. As I climbed the stairs again, I noticed that the house had changed. The air was heavy, and I could feel the presence of evil everywhere. The mother sat on a chair in the living room when I opened the door. Her eyes were wide, and she looked at me as if she knew what I had found downstairs. "You knew it all along," I said sharply, without raising my voice. "What is this? What have you done?" She looked at me, tears in her eyes, but she said nothing. I could see the guilt in her gaze, yet she remained silent. She knew that what lurked in the house was far older and more powerful than she would ever admit. "The symbols in the cellar," I continued. "They were for protection, weren't they? But they are too old. Their power is," she nodded weakly. "It took Paul because the protection is broken. It won't stop. It will take more." The silence was oppressive, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the creature would return to take us. "There's a way to stop it," I said, determined, "but you have to tell me the truth." The mother took a deep breath and finally began to speak. She told me about the dark history of the house. It was over 100 years old and once belonged to a family deeply involved in occult practices. The signs in the cellar were protective symbols derived from an ancient ritual that the family performed to keep something evil at bay. But when the family died, the ritual was never renewed. "I knew it," she said softly, "but I thought nothing would happen as long as we had nothing to do with it." But she had been wrong. The evil lurking in the walls of the house had awakened, and it had taken Paul. Now it wanted more. "We have to renew the signs," I said, although I had no idea how that would work or stop it before it takes us both. She nodded hesitantly and showed me an old book hidden in a box in the cellar. It contained instructions for the ritual, but the page with the crucial part was torn. Time was running out, and I knew we had to act. The knocking grew louder, and I could feel the creature approaching. We went back into the cellar. The book in hand, the mother was visibly frightened, but she followed me. We began to renew the old signs on the wall as best we could, but without the complete text of the ritual, it was risky. I knew it could go wrong, but there was no other choice. The knocking became deafening, and then I saw it. The creature was back, a massive, menacing figure emerging from the darkness. I felt the cold emanating from it, and knew it was only seconds before it would take us. In a last act of desperation, the mother seized the book. "It wants me," she whispered, "not you." Before I could stop her, she ran directly towards the creature, which awaited her with open arms. The air grew heavy, and I could barely breathe as she vanished into the darkness, and with her the knocking fell silent. I stood there, stunned, as the cellar was once again engulfed in silence. The creature was gone, and with it the mother. I knew she had sacrificed herself to appease the evil. But Paul was still missing, and I knew that the house still held its secrets. In my career as a detective, I had handled many strange cases, but nothing could have prepared me for what awaited me in this village. It was a sleepy, remote hamlet in the middle of nowhere, where time seemed to have stood still. A call from the local police had alerted me to the case. Within a few weeks, several residents of the village had vanished without a trace. What initially seemed like a simple case of missing persons quickly turned into something far more sinister. Communications from the village had abruptly ceased. No calls, no sightings. It was as if the few remaining villagers had also disappeared into thin air. The police had cordoned off the area, but no one dared to enter. There were rumors that the village had gone silent, that no sound could be heard there anymore. Curious and skeptical at the same time, I packed my equipment and set off. As I reached the village, I was immediately struck by the eerie silence. No wind, no birdsong, not even the rustling of leaves. It was as if the entire place was caught in some kind of vacuum. The village itself looked ancient, the houses made of weathered wood, the windows dark and empty. I parked my car on the edge of the village and stepped out. The air was cold, and an uncomfortable feeling settled over me like a heavy blanket. Something was wrong here. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. I began to move through the empty, fog-shrouded streets. The silence was absolute. Each of my footsteps echoed on the cobblestones, as if the ground beneath me were endless. No dog barked, no door creaked. I looked through the windows of the abandoned houses and saw nothing, no people, no signs of life, as if the village had been deserted overnight. What disturbed me most was the complete absence of sound. Even my own movements seemed muffled. I called out to someone, but my voice seemed to vanish into the fog. As if swallowed by the thick walls of mist, it was as if the village itself had silenced me. I searched the first few houses and found the same thing everywhere: abandoned furniture, left behind belongings, but no people. There were no signs of struggle or looting, yet the sudden absence of life was unnatural. I couldn't explain it, but I felt I was being watched. As I continued, I noticed something strange. Symbols carved into the walls of some houses, crude and hasty, as if left in a last-minute panic. They weren't normal signs. They looked like protective symbols found in ancient legends, yet they had something disturbing about them. I took photos and continued on my way, even though I knew I was delving deeper into the unknown. I decided to examine the village more closely, hoping to find clues about the fate of the villagers. My next destination was the village church, the only larger structure in this desolate settlement. The building was old and dilapidated, but it radiated an uncanny power. Something told me I would find answers there. When I opened the heavy wooden doors of the church, the musty smell of decay hit me. Inside, it was dark, and the few windows were covered with grime. I shone my flashlight around and saw that the church pews were empty, except for some rotting books scattered on the floor. It seemed as if the entire village had retreated here before vanishing. At the back of the church, near the altar, I discovered a trapdoor, half hidden under an old carpet. It was old, rusty, and seemed not to have been used for a long time. Yet something drew me to it. I opened the trapdoor and saw a steep staircase leading into the darkness. A musty draft rose to meet me, and I knew this was the path I had to take. With a queasy feeling in my stomach, I descended the creaking steps. at the bottom. The darkness was so dense that even the light of my flashlight illuminated only a small area in front of me. But I could hear something, a faint whisper that seemed to come from the depths of the cellar. It was the first sound I had heard since my arrival in the village. I followed the whispering deeper into the underground. The cellar beneath the church seemed larger than I had expected, almost like a labyrinth. The walls were lined with damp stones, and the floor was slippery with moisture. I moved carefully, but the whispering grew louder. It was eerie, as if the walls themselves were speaking to me, and although I couldn't understand the words, I felt they were calling to me. I went deeper into the underground vault until I finally came upon a large, open chamber. In the middle of the chamber stood a large stone on which something lay. As I approached, I realized it was a figure, a lifeless-looking form wrapped in coarse cloths. But as I drew closer, I noticed that it wasn't dead, it was breathing faintly. My heart skipped a beat. Who was this person? Was she the key to the events that had happened here in the village? Before I could ponder further, the figure opened its eyes wide, empty, devoid of all emotion. Its lips moved slowly, and I heard the whispering again, this time directly in my head. The words echoed within me, but I couldn't understand them. Suddenly, the figure moved jerkily, as if pulled by invisible strings. I recoiled, my hand clutching the flashlight tightly. Whatever this was, it was not human. It was as if the being lying here was controlled by something else, something far darker and more evil. The figure's eyes fixed on me, piercing and intense, as if looking directly into my soul. The whispering in my head grew louder, and I felt my own thoughts overshadowed by this uncanny sound. It felt as if the darkness around me was not only filling the room, but also growing within me, consuming me. I turned and ran back to the stairs, but the darkness followed me as if it had a presence of its own. I couldn't bear the whispering anymore. It was everywhere in my thoughts, in the air around me. As I reached the stairs, I looked back and saw the figure slowly rise. It moved mechanically, like a puppet pulled by strings, and came towards me. I rushed up the stairs, almost stumbling, as the whispering grew louder and louder. At the top, I slammed the trapdoor shut and pushed the old carpet over it, as if that would be enough to seal the evil below. But I knew it wasn't over. This village was not just abandoned, it was cursed. As I stepped out of the church, the silence outside was even more oppressive. The symbols I had seen earlier on the houses now seemed clearer to me. They were protective signs, ancient symbols that had been used against something, perhaps against the creature I had just seen below. But the signs had lost their effect. The evil was free. I knew I had to dig deeper to find the truth. The villagers had disappeared, but why? And what was that presence in the catacombs beneath the church? I decided to go to the mayor's house. If anyone had information about the village's past, it would be him. The mayor's house was the largest building in the village, but it looked deserted like the rest. Inside, I found old records, yellowed papers that were barely legible. But what I discovered was disturbing. Over 100 years ago, this village had been the scene of a dark ritual. A cult had tried to summon an ancient power to save the village from a famine, but the ritual had gone wrong. Instead of receiving help, the cult had unleashed something evil, a presence that had haunted the village ever since. The villagers had never renewed the ritual, fearing to fail again. Instead, they had placed protective signs on their houses, hoping to keep the darkness at bay. But with time, the signs weakened, and the evil began to spread again. I had the feeling that what I had seen in the catacombs was the last remnant of this failed ritual, and now it was awake. The more I learned about the village's history, the more I felt I was in danger. The whispering I had heard in the church wouldn't leave me. It seemed to follow me even after I left the mayor's house. Every step I took was accompanied by this uncanny sound, as if the darkness was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I felt my mind gradually becoming clouded. The silence of the village, the whispering in my head, everything began to overwhelm me. It felt as if the darkness of the village was also growing within me, my thoughts becoming more and more confused, and I no longer knew what was real and what wasn't. Was what I had seen down in the cellar real, or was my mind playing tricks on me? The events I had experienced in the village seemed increasingly surreal, as if the village itself was trying to break my mind. I no longer had a clear idea of how I would survive all this, but I knew I couldn't give up. Night fell and the village became even more eerie. The fog had grown thicker, and I could barely see my hand in front of my face, but I knew I had to go back to the church. The cellar was the key to everything, even if the thought of returning there made me sick. Whatever lurked down there had to be stopped. With a deep breath, I made my way back to the church. Every step felt like a march into certain death, but I had no choice. The presence in this village would not stop until it had consumed everything, and I would not let that happen. As I entered the church, I knew this was my last attempt. The whispering was back, louder and clearer than ever before. I went directly to the trapdoor and opened it. The darkness beneath seemed to await me. But this time I was not afraid. I knew I had to face the evil. Down in the catacombs, it was colder than before, and the whispering echoed louder through the passages. The figure I had seen earlier was back. It stood in the middle of the room, motionless, as if it had been waiting for me. But this time it seemed larger, more threatening. Its eyes were wide open, and they fixed on me as if wanting to look deep into my soul. The whispering grew louder, and I felt my mind almost break. Yet I forced myself to remain steadfast. I knew this was the moment when I would either lose everything or save the village. I had to find out how to reverse the ritual, but I had no idea how. The figure moved slowly towards me, and I felt the cold emanating from it. I had no weapons, no protection. But at that moment, I remembered the old protective signs on the walls of the village. Perhaps that was the solution. I began to sketch the symbols as best I could remember them. My hands trembled, but I managed to scratch the signs onto the floor as the creature came ever closer. As I finished drawing the last signs on the floor, the figure suddenly paused. It was as if it was forced to stop. The whispering grew fainter, and for a moment I thought I had succeeded, but the calm was deceptive. The creature began to move again, this time faster, more determined. The protective signs didn't seem strong enough to stop it. In my desperation, something occurred to me. The villagers had sacrificed themselves to hold back the evil. The figure down in the cellar was the remnant of this dark ritual, and only another sacrifice could finally stop it. I knew there was no other way. With a heavy heart, I grabbed the small, rusty blade I had found nearby. I knew I had to complete the ritual by sacrificing myself. It was the only way to save the village and banish the evil once and for all. As I put the knife to myself, the whispering seemed to cease. The figure paused, as if sensing my resolve. With trembling hands, I completed the ritual that had begun so many years ago. A sharp pain shot through me, and I felt my blood drip onto the ancient symbols. The cold in the chamber receded, and the darkness began to withdraw. The figure disappeared slowly and silently, as if it had never existed. The whispering was gone, and for the first time since my arrival in the village, an oppressive silence reigned. I knew the evil was finally defeated, but the price was high. As I left the church, the village was quieter than ever before. The fog had dissipated and the sky was clear. But the silence that now surrounded me was not the same as before. It was a peaceful silence, as if the village had finally found peace. I knew I would never return here. The village had been cursed, but now that the ritual was complete, it was free. Yet I had left a part of myself in those catacombs. The whispering might never fully release me. I got into my car, turned the key, and drove away. The village disappeared behind me, a relic of the past that was better forgotten. But in the distance, as the wind rustled through the trees, I thought for a brief moment I heard the faint whispering again.